Let me begin with my abstract. And it's been said when you give a PowerPoint, you shouldn't read it off the screen, but I'm going to read it right off the screen because I put a lot of effort into this, and it's really a crystallization of what my talk is about. Former Crown Prince Naruhito's accession to the chrysanthemum throne on May 1st of this year literally marked the beginning of a new era in Japan. Japan keeps time using two sets of calendars, the Gregorian, by which this is the year 2019, and the Japanese imperial one, by which we find ourselves in the first year of the era called Reiwa, Reiwa Gannen. Reiwa started and will end with the reign of the current emperor. The official translation of Reiwa is beautiful harmony. Is that all it means? Is that all it can mean? Much has been made of the fact that the name was selected from a passage in a work of classical Japanese literature, the 8th century Mon Yoshio, rather than a Chinese one. Why is that? Where precisely did it come from? These and other questions will be posed and answered in this talk. And this is my outline. I've got an introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gengo or era name system, Nengo system in a moment. And then after that, I'll speak about Reiwa and Mon Yoshio, and then I've got some closing thoughts. So you know where I'm going, and more importantly, you're going to know when I'm finished. I'm not going to sneak up on you. All right. As I said, Japan has two calendars. The Western one dates the year 1 as its beginning. It's supposed to be the birth of Jesus. It's actually off by about 5 years. Jesus was born, we think, in about 5 BC. He was born before Christ, but it's funny how that worked out. And when they created that calendar, it was a couple centuries later they did their best estimate to try and figure that out. That was the Gregorian calendar introduced in 1582. Many other countries besides Japan have two calendars. They have two sets of calendars. Taiwan, for example, the year 1 is, I think it's 1913, the founding of the Republic of China. There's the Hebrew calendar, etc. And this is year 1. Every year, every reign has a new name. There's Meiji, there's Taisho, there's Showa, there's Heisei, and now we have Reiwa. This began as the 31st year of the Heisei era. And on May 1st, it became Reiwa, and it's now Reiwa Gannen. It almost erases everything that came before it. Before the Meiji period, they actually changed the names of the reigns quite often. Right now, the name can only be changed when there's a new emperor. That's the law. The Japanese diet decides how these things work, and you can't change it. But before that, for example, if there was some kind of disaster, like an earthquake or a famine, they would change the reign name. It's like for good luck. Just change it and think better things are going to happen to us, in addition to having a new emperor. And these reign names are a big deal. Of course, they're used in official government documents, but they're also used in private documents. A lot of places will use it, and they had to switch over completely. Some people prefer to use the Western year, but for example, if you're talking to people about what year you were born, when I go to Japan and I tell them the Western year I was born, they kind of look at me funny, and then I'll say, Showa 44年, and then, oh, okay, we got you, yeah, we got you covered. It's going to be a little tricky with the new era, but we'll figure it out. Reign names, I don't know if there's any tech people here, reign names could create problems in computing, because some software programs were programmed when computing power was at a premium to just use a 2-digit year. Okay? And we all saw this in 1999 with the Y2K problem. 96, 97, 98, 99, and then you hit the year 2000 and you've got a real problem. The Japanese actually already ran into this problem at the end of the Showa period in 1989, because they were doing the same thing, but they were using the Showa numbers. So it was Showa, 60, 61, 62, and then all of a sudden they had to change things. The smart programmers switched completely over to a 4-digit system, and they didn't have to do anything during Y2K. They don't have to do anything now. The people who were a little bit less foresighted maybe had to make some other adjustments. But it's amazing in how many directions that the change of the reign name will affect people's lives. And so since the Meiji period, the only time that the end of an imperial reign has occurred has been with the death of an emperor. It's been that way, one emperor and one reign. And what's unusual about what's happening now is that the previous emperor is still alive and well. He had a very demanding schedule. He's really kind of like a diplomat. And he reached the age of 85, so he took a very well-earned retirement. And he was succeeded by his eldest son, who was only 59 years old. He's the new emperor. And I would say that the retirement is not just the preferred term, but it's really the accurate term for what he's doing. Some people say he abdicated, you know. Well, abdication has this negative connotation. People say abdicated his responsibility. The previous emperor did not abdicate anything. He really served until the age of 85, and then he's got this retirement. So I think that's the best way to describe it. And so the retirement of the emperor, which was not unprecedented at all, except in the modern period, and it didn't conform to the law. I believe the law actually had to be changed to make the new reign name permissible. And so they did that. But this retirement that everybody made a big fuss about, should we let the emperor retire? You know, things like that came up, is very common. In the Heian and medieval periods, for example, roughly the year 900 to 1600, emperors retired all the time. Sometimes they would even take Buddhist holy orders, and then we would call them in English cloistered emperors. Or sometimes they would retire at very young ages. They would take the throne at a young age. So it would be not uncommon for a boy to become emperor at the age of 10. And he was retired at the age of 20. He was running around being retired emperor. In the early medieval period, for example, from around 1150 to 1250, there were often multiple retired emperors. If you're retiring at the age of 20, and then your son retires, you're only 30 or 40 years old, you've got, you know, I want to say dueling, you've heard of dueling banjos, dueling emperors, and this created a lot of problems. Being a retired emperor had its advantages. They could travel more than a reigning emperor. They could meet with foreigners, which was regarded as taboo for a sitting emperor to do. And they had great authority and prestige. If the emperor, for example, is the most prestigious person in the whole country, well, what about his father? Couldn't that be even more prestigious and more powerful? I think that's true. This period actually of Japanese history is called Insei, reign of the retired emperors. In is a cloistered emperor, and they were actually controlling the country for a while. And the origins of the conflict that we now know as the Genpei War between the Minamoto and the Taira families arose through a rivalry between retired emperors. The two families, the Minamoto and the Taira, had each backed a different retired emperor, and the retired emperors brought them into the fray, and that gave us the Genpei War. Nobody really expects that to happen now. We're not going to have dueling emperors, but it's still a big deal. I would say in comparison to the Western calendar, it's a little bit bigger than having a new decade, but it's not as big a deal as having a new century. It's somewhere in between. In any event, people feel that something has changed, something is new, even though it's a little bit arbitrary. The essence of the imperial family, after all, is continuity. And things can't change that much. They mustn't change that much. But I was in Japan right around the end of the Heisei period, and there was a feeling. There was also a lot of retrospective commentary on TV. Heisei era. What was Heisei? Everything I knew about Japan directly, I knew from, it was all Heisei Japan. I didn't arrive until the second year of Heisei, 1990. So for me, even though I'm not Japanese, it was a little bit nostalgic. There was a sense of nostalgia, but the general impression I got that it was, Heisei was a sad time when you look back. It started with a lot of hope, but there were a lot of catastrophes. The great Hanshin earthquake, which occurred in Osaka and Kobe in 1995. The poison gas attack on the Tokyo subway, which occurred the same year. What a year that was. And of course, more recently, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident that occurred in northeastern Japan in 2011. And during this whole time, the economy remained weak. And so for a lot of people, they were looking forward to something new, like a fresh start. There was also a lot of speculation during that time about what the new name was going to be called, and the deliberations proceeded in secret until the government chose the new name. I have to say, I accurately predicted that the new name would not begin with the English letter M, T, S, or H, because the preceding eras of Meiji, Taisho, Showa, and Heisei, respectively, began with those initials. And people sometimes will use these initials as a shorthand. Instead of writing Showa 44, you could write S44 or something like that. So you can have a new name that's going to start with one of those English letters. And we have R. We're now in R1. Here we are. And so I was very proud when that came true, but I was not ready at all for Reiwa. It caught me completely by surprise, and I'll explain to you why. But let me first tell you a little bit about how these reign names are chosen. Who decides what the new era is going to be? Is it the outgoing emperor? No. Is it the incoming emperor? No. Do they have a popular vote? No. Who decides? The government. The cabinet takes a vote in consultation with some officials, such as the head of the upper and the lower house of the Diet. Well, who proposes these names? In the case of Reiwa, there was a panel of consultants chosen by the government again. And this is a very typical pattern, actually. It goes back, we see, I gave my talk on Fujiwara no Teika last autumn, and I talked about his diary. He talks in his diary about the selection of the Karoku era, which was around the 1220s, and the process that was used. He actually didn't want them to use the name Karoku because it sounded a little bit like the Chinese reading, Sino-Japanese reading for deer, Shika, Ka, and then Roku, another one. And he says, it doesn't make any sense. And he complains, he says, the people who are choosing the reign name can't even read Chinese. What business do they have doing this? And they picked it anyway. So grumbling is very common, and then having it done in secret and having it done by consultants is also very common. So where do these names come from? Well, let me tell you. Here's the Meiji period, lasting from 1868 to 1912. And the name Meiji means something like enlightened government. And it signaled a radical change from the previous era in which the Tokugawa shogunate controlled the country into, after the Meiji Restoration, the restoration of imperial rule. So it signals a change, and I have to say it's a little bit of a slight to the previous government. If you call your reign enlightened government, what was the people before you? But they got their digs in. And the characters Mei and Ji can be found in close proximity in two Chinese texts, one of which is the I Ching, which you might be familiar as a divination, well, mainly as a divination text, the Book of Changes. I'll spare you my terrible Chinese pronunciation with all the tones that are messed up, and I'll give you the Japanese kundoku reading. Seijin nanmen shite tenka o kiki mei ni mukaite osame. The sages turn their faces to the south when they give audience to all under the sky, administering government toward the region of brightness. They turn toward enlightenment, they turn toward knowledge, and that's how they govern. This is this ideal of the enlightened sage ruler in ancient Chinese history. And that's where the name Meiji comes from. How about Taisho? The Taisho period lasted from 1912 to 1926, and Taisho means something like great and correct. These characters are also said to come from the I Ching. Oi ni torite motte tarashiki wa ten no michi nari. There is great progress and success along with firm correctness. This is the way of heaven. The Showa period lasted from 1926 to 1989, and Showa means something like bright and peaceful. It's said to come from the Chinese classics, the Shujing, the Book of Documents. Hyakusei Shomei, Kyo wa Banpo. His people having become enlightened, the various states were at peace. These are the states that made up China back in the day. These aren't separate nations, well, kind of regarded as countries, but not separate nations. And finally, the Heisei period. As recently as 1989, they were still selecting reign names from the Chinese classics. It means something like stable growth and can be found in the Shujing or the Shujing, the Book of History. We have here Naihei Gaisei. Within the empire there was peace, and beyond it was submission. Okay, this is the 19th century translation I pulled out for this character Sei, Naru, to become. Well, from the Chinese point of view, if your foreign relations are going well, it means that the other countries that you regard as satellites are paying tribute to you, and they're doing, including Japan and Korea and Vietnam, and they're doing what you want them to be doing. And so that's really quite interesting. And then these are all taken from modern times, but they're not unusual in having been drawn from the Chinese classics. all of the era names from the early 700s on were drawn from Chinese texts until this year. In fact, the era name itself is a Chinese import. China used names continuously from 140 BC until 1912, when the last emperor abdicated and the Republic of China was established. So it's quite natural, in a sense, that Japanese reign names would be chosen from Chinese texts. In the recent case of Reiwa, there is a fair amount of information available online about what the other candidates were and who proposed the name Reiwa. It's been reported that a scholar of classical Japanese literature, Nakanishi Susumu, himself suggested Reiwa. On the one hand, it's very interesting to hear about how these decisions were made, what could have been chosen, what was. On the other hand, it takes a little bit of the mystique out of the process. Some people feel that reign names should just sort of fall out of the sky, and no one should ever breathe a word about how they came to be chosen. As Winston Churchill said, never complain, never explain. And I have to confess, I think I am one of those people, and so I'll leave the matter there, and I won't tell you too much. You can look it up online about what happened there. And so it's natural that the Japanese would draw these reign names, or I should say the Japanese government would draw these reign names from Chinese texts, but it's not inevitable. After all, Japan has been using era names continuously for the last 1,300 years, and it now, dare I say, has classics of its own, such as the Kojiki, the Mon Yoshio, the Kokinshu, the Tale of Genji, the Shinkokinshu, Essays in Idleness, and so forth. In fact, we do teach students how to read these books both in the original and in English translation at UW every year. And so I'm going to talk about the relationship between Reiwa and the Mon Yoshio. But first, let me say a few words about the characters that were chosen. And I'd like to start with Wa. Wa, as you know, means peace and harmony, and it's the same character that was used in the Showa period, which lasted from 1926 to 1989, and included Japan's turn toward militarism, the so-called 15-year war, which began in 1937 with its invasion of China, and ended in 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Japan, with almost all of its cities destroyed or in ashes. That was followed by a remaking of the country into the Japan that we know today, a peaceful economic superpower that has in recent years become a cultural superpower. The Showa period was perhaps, as the saying goes from Charles Dickens, it was the worst of times and it was the best of times. Some observers have suggested that the inclusion of Wa was a deliberate choice by the current government, which is politically conservative, to evoke an echo of the Showa period, and by doing so conjure up selected aspects of the period, perhaps the military strength of the early Showa period and the economic dynamism of the middle and late Showa. The character Wa is formed by the following elements. On the left side, and they're kind of flipped here, but if you look at the top, the one that's not a box, we'll call that the left side for a second. It represents the gate to a military camp or fortress, and the right side is said to represent a container for holding documents. It's a document box, it's a file cabinet. What kind of documents are signed in front of a military camp? Peace treaties. And that's what makes Wa related to peace. By extension, it means peace and harmony. And here are the older forms, and it's interesting that sometimes they flip the left and the right. This is a common pattern in ancient characters. The character for Aki, for example, autumn, you'll sometimes see that flipped as well. The character Re is a little bit more interesting. I want to skip ahead to the meaning. Most people in Japan, when they do see this character, they see it in a compound like meire, order, command, imperative. And so they think it has something to do with ordering people around. And that's not unreasonable. Does Reiwa then mean they're ordering someone to be peaceful? Maybe not. Rei is said to represent, take a close look, you can kind of see a figure. It's a human figure. It's somebody who's wearing a ceremonial headdress, and they are listening to divine will while kneeling. Okay? Of course, the divine will, whatever it is, must be obeyed, and hence you get the broader meaning of obedience. And because obeying the will of gods is a good thing, Rei also gained the meaning of good. We can see this in compounds such as reijo, which is a very nice term of respect for someone else's daughter. It means something like your lovely daughter, reijo, and it just means nice, pleasant. Okay? The official Japanese translation of Reiwa is beautiful harmony, and in order to understand where that idea comes from, it's time at last to turn to the Mon Yoshio. The Mon Yoshio is the oldest anthology of Japanese poetry. It was completed in successive phases and was done by 785, which is to say during the Nara period, which lasts from 710, when the capital, which used to move around, was fixed at Nara, until 794, when the decision was made to move it to what is now Kyoto, the beginning of the Heian period, the Heian capital. The title Mon Yoshio means the collection of 10,000 leaves, which suggests that it contains 10,000 poems, but it's a little short. There's only 4,500 poems or so in the Mon Yoshio, but that's still a very large number. And in fact, the number 10,000 suggests just kind of like a zillion, a really big number that's not really specific, even though we know what it is. The Mon Yoshio is quite distinctive for its inclusion of long poems called choka. They don't seem very long by Western standards or even by Chinese standards, but they are quite long compared to the tanka form, which is only 31 syllables, and the even shorter haiku form, which everyone knows is 17 syllables in the pattern 5-7-5. The Mon Yoshio occupies a unique place in the Japanese imagination. Although most of the poems are attributed to poets who were connected to the imperial court in some way, like the famous poet Kakinomoto no Hitomaro, it includes a substantial number of anonymous poems and poems that were attributed to low-ranking or obscure people. And so it's regarded as a kind of democratic anthology, one by the people and for the people. Indeed, unlike the Kokinshu and many other of the famous anthologies of waka poetry, the Mon Yoshio was not officially commissioned by the imperial court. The Mon Yoshio is also important to those who are seeking to identify the elusive essence of Japan. Nihonjin-ron, which is to say the theory of what makes the Japanese, is a cottage industry in Japan, and there have been many books produced on the topic. It's easy enough to compare Japan with a Western country such as the United States, which is culturally almost its exact opposite. And you might think that you have it all figured out. But things get considerably more difficult when you start to compare Japan with countries that are much more similar to it, like Korea and Taiwan. After all, it's former colonies. It would be strange if they weren't similar to Japan. In terms of traditional culture, China exerted a great influence on the creation of Japanese culture, going all the way back to the creating of the Japanese writing system itself. Therefore, there are no Japanese records that predate the beginning of contact with China, and it's very hard to say what is quote-unquote uniquely Japanese. Scholars and critics turn to the earliest texts like the Mon Yoshio for clues, but these texts are already shot through with Chinese influence, as we'll see later. To think of the Mon Yoshio as somehow purely Japanese literature, devoid of foreign influence, is, in my view, a mistake. Many of the poems that appear in the Mon Yoshio are composed in and around the Nara Basin, so it's tempting to think of it as Nara literature, Nara bungaku, but not just chronologically, but also spatially, geographically. This is, in my view, also a mistake. One of the most important centers of literary activity represented in the Mon Yoshio was the government office called Dazaifu in Kyushu, the bottom left. You see here the city of Fukuoka, not far from it, but pretty distant in pre-modern terms between the Nara located on this map between Kyoto and Osaka. And so Dazaifu was located in what is now Fukuoka Prefecture. The Dazaifu was an office in charge of governing the island of Kyushu, receiving foreign envoys and providing for maritime defense of the region. Court officials were sent from the capital to lead it, sometimes as a kind of exile. And this might be hard for us to believe because everybody now loves to go to Kyushu to eat the delicious food and to hang out at the great hot springs, but people back in the day felt differently. The most famous such person is Sugawara no Michizane, who came from a great line of scholars and was sent to Dazaifu after he was slandered at court. He died there, and when a series of natural disasters befell the capital and even the emperor at Dazaifu in Kyushu. Tabito came to know another official and poet, Yamanoue Okura, whose dates are 660 to 733. And Okura had actually traveled to China as an envoy, and he was very well familiar with Chinese verse. He also has many poems included in the Mon Yoshio. So the Mon Yoshio isn't just Nara literature, it's in many ways Kyushu literature as well. Let's get to the gathering. The Mon Yoshio is composed of 20 volumes, and in the 5th volume we find a set of 32 waka poems. Japanese poems in 31 syllables with the following preface. This is the original preface. As you can see, it's in classical Chinese. It's not in what we would call Japanese. This is very important. It's likely, however, when it was read aloud, and these people really read aloud a lot more than we do. They read not just with their eyes, but with their ears, with their mouths. And this is what it would sound like. Tenpyo ninen, excuse me, Baika no uta 32首情を合わせたり、天平2年正月13日、そちろうの家に集まり、演歌を述ぶ。時に初春の霊月、木麗しく風和らぐ。梅は狂然の子に開き、蘭は背後の香りに香る。鹿のみにあらず、あけぼのの峰に雲移りて、松は羅をかけて絹笠を傾け、ゆべの茎に切り結びて、鳥は米の絹に閉ざされて林に迷う。庭に新書を舞い、空に小雁変える。ここにおいて天を絹笠にし、地を敷居にし、膝を近づけ、杯を飛ばす。ことを一室の裏に、内に忘れ、衣の首を演歌の他に開く。単然として自ら欲しいままにし、改善として自らたる。もし観念にあらざれば何をもってか心を述べん。死に落梅の変を記す。古今それ何ぞ異ならむ。よろしく塩梅を付していささかに丹下をなすべし。That's the preface from which Reiwa comes. And here's an English translation. 32 plum poems with preface. The translation is by Edwin Cranston. On the 13th day of the first month of Tenpyo 2, 730, people gathered at the residence of the Venerable Governor General and held a party. It is now the choice month of early spring. The weather is fine, the wind is soft. The plum blossoms open, powder before a mirror. The orchids exhale, fragrance after a sachet. Furthermore, clouds move across dawn peaks. Pines are draped with gauze, holding sunshades over their shoulders. Evening summits are caught in mist, and birds wander lost in the grove, closed in by silken veils. In the garden, new butterflies dance. In the sky, old geese return home. And so, with heaven as a parasol and earth as a mat, seated knee to knee, the guests send the wine cup flying. Words are forgotten in the chamber, collars are turned out to the smoky haze. In lightness comes release, in pleasure contentment. Were it not for the garden of leathers, with what could we express our feelings? In Chinese poetry, there are sets on the fallen plum blossoms. How is the past then different from the present? Let us take the plums in the arbor as our topic and spend a while making short compositions. And it's followed by 32 poems. I'd like to take a moment here to show you a piece of calligraphy that was brought here today. This is the beginning of that section, Shoshu, Reigetsu, etc., etc. It was done by Doi Sensei here, a calligrapher, in beautiful cursive Chinese calligraphy. I'm very happy to have it here. It's that whole section from the choice month of early spring down to the plum blossoms open, powder before a mirror, the orchids exhale, fragrance after a sachet around there. And really, really lovely, lovely description of the weather, the climate, and it's the translation doesn't do justice. Even the Japanese printed original doesn't do justice. You really need to see it in brushwork.
than by a person, such as we have here, and we have the one there by Shizu-san and Doi. Thank you very much for bringing this. It's really special.
So the 13th day of the first month by our calendar corresponds to about February 8th, and they're calling this early spring. It's usually still quite cold in Seattle around this time. In fact, I think it was snowing heavily around February 8th this year, if I remember correctly. But Japan is typically warmer, especially southern Japan, but also southern China, which is where this traditional seasonal calendar was established. Spring, kind of baton touch, and they can relay race, go back and forth, becomes decisively spring. And the first flower to bloom is the plum blossom, ume. It's really called the Japanese apricot, that's the scientific name. It blooms when the air is still quite crisp, and for this reason it's prized for its hardiness. It's a symbol of toughness, resilience, strength. It blooms while it's still cold. It's also associated with this very powerful fragrance. The plum is also closely associated with Chinese culture. In the Mon Yoshio, for example, when the word flower hana appears by itself, we can tell by the context that it typically refers to plum blossoms. By the time of the Kyushu, which is compiled a little bit more than 100 years later, the same word hana, when unmarked, typically refers to cherry blossoms, which are of course tightly associated with Japanese culture. And by this symbol index, we can see the degree of Chinese influence during the time of Mon Yoshio. The poems that follow this preface are really quite forgettable. As the saying goes, you had to be there. You had to be there at the moment, enjoying the arrival of spring after a long winter, drinking with your friends and reciting poems with plum blossoms in your hair. Nonetheless, let me give you one to give you a sense of what they were writing. And this is by the host himself, Otomo no Tabito. Waga sono ni ume no hanachiru hisakata no ame yori yuki no nagare kuru kamo. In my arbor now, petals scatter from the plum, or is it snow that floats down drifting over us from the boundless sky? This elegant confusion of mistaking the whiteness of falling blossoms for snow is quite common in waka poetry, although it's more familiar to us with cherry blossoms. But we should bear in mind that these poems are composed long before the Kokinshu. Ariwara no Narihira, for example, had not even been born. He would not be born for another 100 years. And so the trope might be kind of a bit fresher at that time. It's also somewhat more believable to mistake plum blossoms for snow because they bloom so early, in contrast to cherry blossoms which bloom in the mid-spring. Let's get back to the preface and switch gears, and let's really switch gears. One of the most famous pieces of Chinese calligraphy is by Wang Xizhi. In Japanese, he's called O Gishi. His dates are 303 to 361, and he wrote the preface, brushed the preface to a gathering at a place called Lanting. It's sometimes called the Orchid Pavilion Preface. This gathering was held in 353, almost 400 years before the gathering that Tabito hosted at his house in Kyushu. At that time, Wang himself was a provincial governor, and he hosted this excursion on the third day of the third month. There were 41 people who participated and wrote a poem, either in Chinese, of course, either 5-syllable line poems or 7-syllable line poems. Some people wrote both types of poems. There were 15 people who could not come up with a poem, and they were punished. They were punished by each being forced to drink 1.5 gallons of wine. I hope it wasn't really strong wine. Interestingly, Wang's version is not extant. I think it disappeared in the Tang period, but there's a very old tracing, which you see here. It's held by the Palace Museum in Beijing. As early as the Edo period, from 1600 to 1868, commentaries on the Mon Yoshio, commentators noticed the similarities between the preface to Tabito's gathering and the preface to Wang's gathering. For example, here is Wang's description of the day and the weather. And again, I'll give it to you in classical Japanese. Kono hiya ten hogaraka ni ki kyoku keifu wachirosu. As for this day, the sky is clear and the air is fresh. The mild breeze greets us. I think you can already get a sense of what's happening. Going back to the preface, the Tabito's preface, we think it's by him. Toki ni shoshun ne reigetsu ki uruwashiku kaze yawaragu. It is now the choice month of early spring, the weather is fine and the wind is soft. This is the source of the phrase Reiwa. Edwin Cranston here translates Rei as choice and Wa as soft. By extension, the phrase Reiwa connotes peace and harmony, like the soft wind of early spring, but also the beauty and the elegance of that season. It's not too cold, it's not too hot. The austere chill of winter gives way to a subtle warmth, with the hints and promises of growth, suffused by the fragrance and illuminated by the blossoms of the plum trees. Not only that, but the broader occasion of this preface, a group of friends, acquaintances, colleagues, and associates who have gathered to celebrate the arrival of spring with food, drink, poetry, conversation, and music, and probably a little bit of dancing. This suggests an ideal world in which people have the material prosperity and the cultural sophistication to engage in such an elegant pastime. By wrapping itself in the banner of Reiwa, Japan portrays itself not only as a peaceful country, but as a cultural country, a cultural superpower. In my view, this is wholly appropriate, based not only on the many years I have spent studying traditional Japanese culture and getting to know its subtle intricacies, but also on my very unscientific survey of the kind of people I see traveling to Japan these days. When I first visited Japan in the second year of the Heisei period, it was still a little bit exotic and slightly off the beaten track. You ran into backpackers, or you ran into seasoned world travelers who had seen all of Europe and they had finally gotten around to the so-called Far East. There were also some business people. It was the tail end of the bubble, and some people still thought that Japan had all the financial answers. And now you go, and there are all kinds of people from all walks of life, including Chinese people who go in part to see what China has lost. Japan is in many ways no different to us than France or Italy. We go there to visit the gardens and the museums, walk around the streets, and eat the delicious food, and not to mention to enjoy the best hospitality in the world. This is the end. Let me try to wrap up some of these threads and summarize the most important points. The rain name Reiwa does mean something like beautiful harmony, as the official translation has it, but it connotes so much more than that. It does not, however, have anything to do with ordering people around. It's significant that the name Reiwa was drawn not from one of the ancient Chinese classics, but from a Japanese classical literary text, the Mon Yoshio. This signals a cultural independence from China, which actually had been extant for a very long time. It's just finally acknowledged and recognized. But a closer look at the context shows us that there really is no clean break with traditional Chinese civilization with this choice. The text of the preface was itself written in Chinese. It was consciously modeled after a similar preface written on a similar occasion in China some 400 years earlier, and the poems, which I have not had a chance to go into in much detail, are also thoroughly influenced by Chinese poetry. These points aside, Japan, which adopted the rain name system, has maintained it all these years, while China has abandoned it in the previous century when it ended the imperial system. Does Reiwa mean beautiful harmony? Yes, I think that is a fair translation based on the context of the original passage. But the word rei is more than aesthetic. It has an ethical dimension, embedded in its original meaning of listening to the way of heaven, and by extension, doing the right thing. True beauty, it is said, comes from within. And the beauty of rei originates in a voice we hear within ourselves, telling us how to act, and manifests itself in behaving with kindness and consideration toward other people. I hope I've answered the questions that I've set out for myself in the abstract, and I've left you with a better sense of the complexity of the rain name system and the issues involved in choosing the new name Reiwa. I'd like to close by saying that I hope that the Reiwa period brings all of us the good things that the name suggests. It brings us to Japan and to all the countries of the world, including this one. We need all the beautiful harmony we can get. Thank you for your attention.